Hello, everyone. Better put on my microphone so everybody can hear me better. I am not Dr. Ann Hughes. Regrettably, Dr. Ann Hughes is terribly sick, and so I get to pitch hit for her. But rest assured, I know a lot about this area because we do work on this collaboratively a lot, and I'm going to go over this. The good news is, I guess the bad news is you got to tolerate me for the next 45 minutes. But the good news is Dr. Ann Hughes will be recording it so that you have her great insight as well. And that should give you double dose of what you need to know. Now, we all know with autism, when we're dealing with autism, we've got issues with communication, social communication, social interactions, and behavior. And so these are things that obviously that we work on, and we deal with those deficits that a student may have in those areas. And in school, our goal is to be that safety net so they can learn the skill sets so that they can be successful out in the community and post-secondary. We do that with all students with disabilities, and like many students with disabilities, we have children who also have emotional disabilities, which could be comorbid with autism. And again, our whole thing with a student who has emotional disability is teaching self-regulation, but the other part with a student who is autistic, we're looking at teaching them how to deal with situations that they don't understand and are confusing to them and may cause them to react negatively, and teaching them there are certain responses that will be considered acceptable and other responses that don't, and that if you engage in the ones that don't, then it will have repercussions coming up. We deal with, this one is dealing with the juvenile justice, he's basically law enforcement. And law enforcement, we not only deal with outside of school, we also deal with law enforcement in schools. And that's one of our greatest challenges that we deal with, is ensuring that we are working to make the school environment one in which our police, our security, resource officers, our law enforcement, if you have local police in there, are working to collaboratively with us to help shape students' behavior and work on their skill sets so they will not encounter trouble later on. Now, here's the one thing that I think is important, and I'm sure Anne will go over later as well, is that students with autism not at higher risk of engaging in crime than anybody else. However, they do come into contact with police personnel at disproportionate rates. So that's an interesting thing. They're not committing crimes any more than anyone else, but they are encountering police in a disproportionate rates. And so they estimate that 1 in 36 children in the US have autism, and that individuals with autisms are 7 times more likely to encounter police than neurotypical peers, and 5 times more likely to be arrested during those encounters. And we'll go into that to a certain extent because we can understand what happens in those circumstances. What are the reasons that the children that are on the spectrum, why are they more likely to encounter police more often? And that's a question we have with it. And what we found for the reasons that are the typical with that is wandering and elopement, having behavioral outbursts in public, misinterpretation of their behavior as being threatening or aggressive, and traffic stops. So with these various encounters that they may have, and again, we're taking this out of the realm of committing an actual crime, trying to commit a crime. We're talking about students who are in schools or outside of schools. There are possible ways that there could become issues with them, with the police, that didn't involve necessarily an intentional crime. Now, one thing we know, we have much more positive outcomes when officers are trained, and resource officers we do want to train on all students who have disabilities, particularly students with autism and emotional disabilities. What we do see happen, and that has been a big issue, is if you aren't trained, what things can happen is that you have a misunderstanding and then it just escalates from there. There's use of force or restraint, arrest or detainment. And then we also are looking at what are the effects long term, what kind of trauma does a student have and long-term distrust. Before, and again, it was, I believe, I don't know how many legislative terms before, but we've had in place for some time now that our resource officers within our schools are to be trained on de-escalation techniques within the schools. We also recommend that the officers get training on disabilities, which would include autism and emotional disabilities, and learning how to work with students who have these types of characteristics so that they can have better skill sets on how to de-escalate. Prior to that coming into place, there were many instances where we had students who were with disabilities, including autism, who the police definitely went after in a very aggressive way. We had one student who eloped, and we knew she eloped. And when the principal asked the police officer, resource officer, got her because she was eloping and afraid she was going to go over towards the highway, they got her. And then the principal said, "That's fine, thank you. Please bring her back to school." And he said, "No, I'm taking her in." And the principal said, "No, please don't. We need to address it. This is elopement. We'll work with her. We'll, talk her down when she de-escalates and deal with the issue." And he didn't. He took her into the police station. So of course, what happened? That became a big issue with a parent, as you can imagine. And then there was this huge distrust that happened with the school district and the parent. We've had another situation where we had sweet girl. She was a big girl, kind of the size of a linebacker. So she was pretty intimidating in size. She was probably over 6 feet, who was also autistic. And she loved to ask people what their name, birth dates were. That was one of her things that she would perseverate on, your birth date. She also didn't like people having their legs crossed. That was something that tended to agitate her. So she would uncross people's legs. So obviously within the school context, they were working on it. Well, one day, I was there one time for another ARD meeting, and she came up and got right in my face and said, "Where's your birthday?" And it's like, I couldn't even remember because, she was a little intimidating. She's like, over face. But of course, I gave her one at the end and she was fine. That's all she wanted to hear. But then later in that same day that I was at that campus, she'd go in the bathroom, and I watched when she would go in the bathroom, people would just immediately come out because she would like to cross people's legs. Well, one day she was in the hallway, and for whatever reason, the para may have been sick or something had happened, and she was in the hallway, and she went over to the trophy case, the school, and started shaking it and shaking it and shaking it. And so the police officer saw it, got her into handcuffs, put her on one of those, what are those? The ones rollers where you have your computers. You used to take computers from class to class, and equipment to class to class. He put her on that and wheeled her out to the car. Now, she didn't go to the police, but he took her where she was being detained. And it could have easily been addressed in a much better fashion, in a much more appropriate way, and de-escalated her from doing that. Had he just called the person that worked, those who knew her, including the administration, to de-escalate the situation. One more of the horror stories to throw it out. I had a kid, again, who was autistic, and he came to school in a t-shirt that had a marijuana leaf on it. And the police officer told him to take, and his kid was in middle school. So I believe he was 6th or 7th grade. Police officer said, "You need to change your shirt." And he said, "I'm not going to change my shirt." And he said, "You need to change your shirt because that's there." And the kid didn't obey him. So he took him down the ground and sat on his back, and the principal and the teachers and everybody said, please get off of him, please. This is fine, this is fine, this is fine. And he didn't do it. And so obviously that became a big issue. And when you deal with situations where we're not working as a team, these situations become very messy for schools, because clearly a parent doesn't trust to send their kid to school, and may not at a certain point if they're afraid their child's going to get arrested for behaviors that may be related to their disability, and they're sending them to school. And that fear of having their child involved in the criminal system, because they went to school and something happened, is a situation that unfortunately every once in a while we get. Now, the one thing to note, and that's an important thing to note, is that special ed IDA specifically says that just because you have a disability doesn't mean that criminal laws don't apply to you. So in those situations where we have a student who may hit another student or hits a teacher, we can't preclude that student's parents from filing a criminal charge against that student, nor can we tell the teacher they can't do it, because they have a right to file criminal charges if something happens that they determine was at the level of criminal liability. So you've got to be aware that just because a student has a disability doesn't mean they're immune from criminal responsibility if they knowingly engage in behavior that does cause those issues. With that being said, our goal is to be that safety net as a whole, and we do want to make sure that we create an environment that will allow the student to have his behavior shaped and change the maladaptive behaviors to appropriate behaviors or appropriate responses. And so that is what we do within the school context. And then obviously there have been bills that have passed that allow for that kind of understanding to also be with law enforcement outside of the schools. So we are dealing with it from two different angles: what we do within the school context and what do we do on the outside. So that's all right. One thing that we do know with students who have autism, since it is really a communication deficits, that they have trouble processing language quickly, especially under stress, and following commands quickly in expected ways. Things that are also become issues is failure to maintain eye contact, because if you don't have eye contact, then they think maybe you are guilty or something and are trying to avoid that. Having a delayed response to answers, thinking that let's say they get pulled over for a DUI, a delayed response would be considered to be one of those things they would use and say, listen, that's an issue. Again, if they tell them, I want you to recite the alphabet, they don't do it quickly, then there's issues there. And the one thing that we also have that's a big issue for kids with autism is not the words that are being said, but more often the nonverbal cues. As you all know, with respect to communication, about 30% of it is the spoken word, period. The rest of it is nonverbal cues. And so half of that is teaching them facial expressions if they can't pick that up, tone of voice, sarcasm, inferences, things that do not come naturally to them. As you all know, the one they love to say is like, punctuation is important, and how you say something like, I want to eat grandma versus I want to eat grandma. Those are the way you say it could be interpreted different ways. And for students that have autism, that becomes even more difficult, understanding the nuances of the languages and the pragmatic aspect of language. And so we definitely have that as a focal point when we are working within the schools and helping these students, not just with law enforcement, but across the board, dealing with other people that when engaging in communication. All right, let's go right here. Now, things that are challenging behaviors that you all know and we have seen with students who have these special needs is we have a lot of hand waving and rocking and sudden movements. That students have repetitive behaviors. That's something we would deal with. I think it was interesting. I'm reading the autobiography of Bill Gates, and one of the things he said that he thinks, well, when he rocks, he's always rocked, and so he rocks all the time. Repetition of phrases, if they say the same thing over and over again, or some students who have echolalia, that will repeat what you say, which is another big issue. Obviously, aggressive behaviors and self-injurious behaviors, and possible trauma responses. They think, well, it's just fight or flight. What are we going to do? And then they tend to overgeneralize or, put people in categories. Again, they see the world much more black and white versus gray, which is what the color really is of the world. And so if they have the belief that all police officers are bad, then that's how they're going to look at it. And I can never go anywhere with somebody I don't know. But if a police officer says you need to come with me, then they would have to. And some students with autism tend to also look at it as everything is a catastrophe. It blows it out of proportion to what it is. And so we definitely want to look at it from that angle. We also, because out in public, some of the biggest behavioral challenges we have is with students that have that students are exhibiting in public places is when they approach people. We have one student, okay, of course he's autistic, but he wants to give everybody a hug, strangers alike. He doesn't care who it is, he's going to give him a hug. And if he's in a good mood, it's just a hug. If he's in a bad mood, he'll also start ripping, going towards their hair and pulling as hard as he can, or scratching. So obviously, if somebody sees that happen in the school, and out in Walmart, this kid's going to have issues because they are, first of all, touching another adult or touching another person without their consent is considered an assault. And obviously, if you're pulling the hair and the rest, there's bigger issues. And so we are tasked with having to help these students learn that no touching for those students, people you don't know, and their boundaries, the personal boundaries and the verbal boundaries that you have for different people in these contexts. So we've got to have them understand exactly where is that boundary and how would you respond, meaning also how would you respond if a police officer approaches you. And so if in the school context, we're always going to be spending our time looking at giving them practical skills, giving them social stories, giving them the opportunity to role play in possible scenarios that will come into place. Not unlike what we're trying to get with students who are autistic is it to become habitual to respond in the same way so they don't have to overthink what's happening. They know this is a response if this person in uniform talks to me or if this person talks to me, so that it is habitual, that it is not something they have to search for to see where it is. As many people say in terms of like even a student learning a sport or anything else, what they do is want things to be have automaticity to them, so you don't think about it, it just naturally occurs. The same as when we teach kids manners, to always say yes ma'am or yes sir or thank you and please, that they should be automatic, and they are after a period of time, but the amount of repetition you do even with a child who is neurotypical, it takes forever. So we know that we have to do this repetitively with students who have challenges such as these, so that it will have automaticity when they are dealing in those situations, and they won't be panicked as to what my response should be. All right. Now, we do know that students with disabilities have sensory needs. And so what do we deal with when we're dealing with sensory needs is what kind of things does a student need in order, like they have to grab onto things or have something in place. In schools, we give them the opportunity to have something that's appropriate that they can use, such as a fidget or something else of that nature, or a particular chair that allows them to rock back and forth. But what do we do with our police? The first thing that we do with kids with autism, we want to create the belief that the police encounters are going to be, you have to act in a certain manner. We also want to, even before that, is pre-teach them that, you know, police officers are there for a specific purpose, and let them have encounters with our resource officers so they become familiar with people who wear uniforms, and make them aware that these people are people who are here to keep us safe. And so the first thing we do is work on, what does a police officer do? With books and videos and role playing, we can talk about what are the various roles that they have. The other part is making them very aware of the uniform and badges, and what uniforms and badges apply to what. Obviously, a fireman is going to have a different type of uniform than a police officer has one. The other thing is that this, where their gun is, and police officers will have guns, and that you must never ever go, you know, this touch the gun. And so that's part of what we're working with, is making them know that they must keep no physical contact with the police, that they need to not touch them, they need not to grab anything that's on their person. We also, again, want to let them have and learn throatly safe phrases they could use when they are encountering a police officer. That can be done in a variety of ways by doing scripted interactions where we work on that and work on the response steps. How should you respond in this situation? Giving them the opportunity to experience a variety of situations with police, because they will not all be the same, but they start out the same, and explaining how do you respond each time that occurs. If they are in a car and they are driving, explaining having your insurance and having your driver's license available, and that when a police officer asks you for that, you immediately provide it. You do not challenge that. You work with the police officers that way. In reality, this is good training you would have for any student, but definitely with students that have these communication challenges. We also want to teach them calming techniques for these situations, as we do with any situation for a child with autism where they have anxiety about anything. Our counselors are really good at teaching them calming techniques, things to do, such as breathing, such as counting, doing what they would do to help them not be overwhelmed by the situation, because they're overwhelmed, act in a way that could lead to more escalation of the situation and possible arrest. And we also want them to be able to ask for help, and also make the police officers that they encounter, whether they are on campus or off campus, letting them know that they have autism, which also goes to the next point, which is I think it's smart to consider having self-disclosure ID tags and cards with a diagnosis on it. And as Ann has pointed out, there's samples of that at the on the National Autism Society website. That also is something that can happen, and it's by choice. We'll go into this, and I'll show you the next one, is that you can have it on driver's license. That shows that it's a communication impediment, so they'll have that. What we know is many of the behaviors that students with autism may have, when they become argumentative and non-compliant, because they're questioning it. They say that they get pulled over and there's no reason, because they know they're doing the 10 and 2, they're going the speed limit, and they get pulled over. And they say, if they're not supposed to ask this anymore, is like, you know why I pulled you over? They're supposed to tell you, and they think I've done nothing wrong. You have no right to pull me over. I'm not going to give you anything, I don't have to give you anything. I've had kids that will say things of that nature, which creates an escalation of behavior. Some of their behavior can be interpreted, especially if they don't look at them when they're talking to them, and they're fidgeting around. If somebody was neurotypical and they weren't making contact and were fidgeting around and doing other things, that may give the police officer pause for thinking that's indicative of criminal intent. If you are like a huge buff like I am and watch all the CSIs and Law and Orders, that they will do is they will describe the conduct. And when they describe the conduct, they're going to describe conduct that they think helps to support that there was a reason for them to arrest them or to search their car. And that will be, they were resistant, they were non-compliant, they were argumentative, they were looking away, they were fidgeting with something when we were talking to them. So that's things we have to fully be aware of. It also can be interpreted, some of the behaviors can be interpreted as being under the influence of drugs or alcohol. And so those are big issues. And you got to remember also, when we're dealing with police, non-compliance and non-cooperativeness can really get somebody that's a more A-type, that's a black and white person. They pulled you over, they want you, they know they have control, they want you to comply with what they said to do, and then you don't do it, you escalate them. And not everyone is well trained and has the background to help make the situation be better, especially those outside of schools. And so we've got to work anticipating with our students with autism. We've got to anticipate whatever police officer pulls them over does not have the background of some of our resource officers or a special ed teacher. They are going to be very rule intensive and are going to be very sure, black and white. And if the student doesn't comply, they're going to go after it. So we've got to prepare them for those situations, because those are the situations that are most likely going to happen. Now, one thing I think is very good, and what we really want to do as much as we can, is make sure the police officers in our community have a full appreciation as to our community and the students in our community, which includes our students with autism and other disabilities, and provide them with formal trainings on what does that mean. And we always have trainings on special ed at the beginning of school years. And I think it would be helpful to just open that up to, besides our own resource officers, to local law enforcement, so they know what kind of situations we have. Again, when we look at within the school environment, our goal is to treat it as an opportunity to learn, because once they get out of our school, it's not going to be the same. So they have to have, we have to comply with the BIP. We have to ensure that it's implemented. When you get outside of school, there is no BIP. That's the reality. Then they have to learn how to deal with people who don't have to say, okay, I'm going to redirect, I'm going to ignore that behavior. They don't have to do any of that. So we want them to learn to go beyond that BIP. Remember, a BIP for any student is external controls until the student learns how to self-regulate. And so a BIP is not permanent. It's not supposed to be permanent. It's in place until you learn those skills. Well, if they don't learn those skills and they get out of school, there's nobody who's going to say, hey, you failed to implement the BIP, therefore you're in trouble. They're going to have a consequence for that. So we consider schools, because we do have all these things in place is the opportunity for the student to learn and to grow. And we will realize they will have some behaviors, but our goal, and again, the trajectory for behavior is not just, a linear trajectory. It goes all around, because sometimes we have extinction outbursts, we have other issues there. And so it is a longer process to change behavior. As we all know, many of you may have been on diets like I have for many years, habit, we know what we're supposed to do, but do we do it? That's another thing. It's hard to change behavior, especially when it's a habit. So we want to make these other behaviors that are important for the student to have out here to be automatic. So they know they have good behaviors. They know what they do in those situations. The same as we teach a student to look both ways before they cross the road, we want to teach them the same thing about how to encounter different people of authority, particularly police officers, and what should be an automatic response whenever you are encountering those situations. To me, it has the same critical need for safety for the student as crossing the road, because both have dire consequences if we don't learn what would happen if we don't do it correctly. And so we don't want them to be there. We also believe that, as Anne was talking about, having a meet and greet is a very good way, and having them at informal events are what I think always is helpful to us as much as possible, not only for students on with autism, but neurotypical students and other students with disability, is seeing police officers in a non-threatening situation. So having them at informal events and having a meet and greets, and being around to know that they are people who are there as a whole, who are trying to keep us safe. And so the other things that we do within various situations is do the role play interactions in safe settings, giving every possible scenario there is and help them learn how to respond in each of those situations, and in a repetitive nature, so that they will learn it and also memorialize it, so that they have it available when that circumstance comes forward. So I consider it the same as learning, whenever you're CPR, when you're dealing with CPR, you don't use it that often, but when you have to use it, you got to have it. You can't look at a manual to do it. You've got to have the skill set right there, because when somebody quits breathing, you don't have time to look back on what you're doing. It needs to be automatic. And that's the same for these young adults that encounter police in a situation that is out, either in school or outside of school, and how should they respond? It should be, they can't look at a manual, they can't go back to social stories. It needs to be automatic. One thing that was listed by Anne that she thinks is very helpful is Autism Speaks has a free safety kit available. And this is things that helps give parents tips on what would help you if your child is one who tends to elope, and tips of working for law enforcement when encountering individuals with autism on the spectrum. So next one. One thing we do know that we want to do with law enforcement officers is give them autism recognition training. Things that are important for a law enforcement officer to know, and I think these are important skill sets to have whenever you encounter anyone, but particularly with a student with autism, is that you speak slowly and clearly, something that I'm still working on. And that give one-step directions with time and space. Don't crowd the student, with time and space, and give them the opportunity to process it and comply to what you said. So when you give somebody a directive or a command, giving them the opportunity to process it and then comply. The other thing is avoiding using sarcasm or idioms, because again, people who are with autism may not understand any sarcasm and idioms. And so we really have to look at that. We also look at doing de-escalation techniques. A lot of things can be done to distract people from being upset. And that's the best thing you can do is, talk to the person about a preferred area. Have them thinking about something else versus what's going on. So using de-escalation techniques, redirecting them from what is angering them is very important. And one thing I see a lot with kids on the spectrum is that they will be very upset when somebody doesn't do the rules as they see them. They become upset that somebody has violated the rules in their mind and could attack them. We've got to teach them that, they are not, required to be the person who enforces all rules, and that's an important part. But if they're starting to hit on a student and then they're focused on that student, our police officers, including our other staff, need to be able to know how to de-escalate it by redirecting the child and moving them off of what is currently on their mind. One thing we definitely want to train our police officers and our staff is to avoid unnecessary physical contact. One thing I do know is I've dealt with students that have a strong aversion to touch. And so that's something we have to make them aware of, that unless it's absolutely necessary, we don't need to have physical contact with the student, because that could agitate the student even more. Now, one thing to know that I think is really important, and this, we're moving in that direction for addressing things, is, there is the Project Lifesaver, it's for wandering. Many of you also have, for kids that have tend to elope, many of you have, I think it's Angel device, something that will track them, a GPS that will track the students, so you can deal with that. And then effective September 1st of this year, so it's coming up for the next school year, Texas law is requiring all law enforcement officers to receive 2 hours of training on interacting with individuals with autism, which I think is only going to be helpful. And truly, the skills they will learn in this training, I think, can be generalized for all people. And then we also have, with the Texas Department of Safety, allows autism to be identified as a communication impediment on state driver's license. I think that's a huge thing for you, because when you get pulled over, the one thing they'll ask you for is your driver's license, and the driver's license gives that information. I think you can elect to do that, but I do also think that whoever gets pulled over needs to say, I have this, and if it's on their ID, that will also be confirming what they may be saying. And we also know that there are many local police departments have created a specialized behavioral health unit where police officers and behavioral health personnel respond to calls where behavioral health may be involved, meaning that we're going to get somebody who has training on behavioral health to go with the police officers, so they will be the persons who will be directing how do we respond to this person when behavioral health is an issue. I think that will do very well to help us to have a bigger understanding of what's going on. The other thing is, we have in some states, they have created autism registries, which are voluntary opt-in, but to let people know that that is the issue that exists regarding those students. The big takeaway from all this, from my perspective, is as much as we need to train police officers, which we do, we can't guarantee that's going to happen in every situation. And the quality of that training, we can't have control over. That's something legislatively done, but they could take up their hours with whatever continuing education that exists. The one thing we do have control over is what training we give the students who have autism, and helping them to learn how to address these things within this, through repetitive instruction on it, so that they minimize the opportunity to be, first of all, called over by the police, and second of all, to possibly be arrested by the police. The same as we teach them about appropriate personal boundaries to avoid issues with sexual harassment or some other aspect, we also are teaching them the appropriate interactions with police officers and people in authority. By doing so, we are going to increase their chances of having positive outcomes when they're dealing with police. All righty, I am going to check to see if you have any questions. So let me pull this out real quick. You may not. If you have any questions, let me throw this out. Looks like we may have one. I see something here. It says, will the training being provided to law enforcement officials be specific training that everyone will receive, or is it the discretion of the department? From my understanding, this is actually required training. So it's not the discretion of the department. It's for those that are in the police officers that are obviously working on the streets will have that training. Can you have autism on ID cards as well as a driver's license? And I believe the answer is yes, because you can get an ID that is not a driver's license. And so it allows you to put that language, from my understanding, on both the ID and the driver's license. You know, if you don't have a driver's license, you could have an ID card, which you would need. Remember, we're going to need those ID cards when we travel. You know, the real driver's license or a real ID, something issued by the state that will show that we are in fact citizens and all that fun stuff. But these things I think are very important to have on there so that they at least will walk in with hopefully some understanding from their 2-hour training that we handle this in a different way. The same as we, you know, there's different groups that we handle in different ways. And obviously, you know, if you have, you're deaf or hard of hearing, we're going to have a different way of addressing you versus if you have normal hearing. Well, the same thing with autism. If your communication is your deficit, then there is a different way of approaching a situation, even if the student appears to be agitated, to allow you to de-escalate the situation and actually find out what's happening. So that will always be our goal, is to ensure that we have it from both ends. The student knows how to act when a police officer approaches them, but the police officer knows how to act when one of the students or one of the young adults that they may be dealing with is somebody with autism. It's a two-way street. The only one I can guarantee on, from my perspective, is the training we give our students to help them in any situation. Imagine you could be pulled over by a police officer in an urban area. You'll have a different situation than if you get pulled over by somebody down in, you know, a rural area, or West Texas versus East Texas, or South Texas, you know, versus West Texas. It is all a different environment. So you have got to prepare those individuals for encountering a variety of different people, you know. So I think that will help us the best. The more legislation passes to keep our police and people in authority having the understanding of the differences that students have and young adults have, the better off we're going to be. All righty, I think that's our questions. With that being said, thank you for indulging me and listening to me twice today. That was Anne's much more humorous and is much you know, more delightful with her lovely Irish accent. But you endured it, and I thank you. And she is going to record that, so it will be available to you and will be sent out to you. And we hope you have the most lovely, lovely remainder of the school year. For most of you, it's only 5 more weeks. Unfortunately, I parked at one of my schools and it's 8 more weeks for them, but you're not most of them. So most of you are 5 weeks, and I hope you have the most lovely Easter holiday. Thanks so much.